Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about BRICS, the trading alliance between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa that now has 10 members. And in a recent video, I asked the question as to whether or not this trading alliance had any longevity because Donald Trump recently came out and said that he was going to impose an additional 10% tariff on any nation that was acting in an anti-American way and aligning itself with the BRICS policies. And interestingly, only a few days after that statement, and also a couple of days after the end of the BRICS Summit that was held in Brazil, Donald Trump has come out and announced that he's imposing a 50% tariff on all imports from Brazil, which obviously is the leading nation in terms of the acronym BRICS. It's the first one, it's the B. And the reason why he said that he's doing this is quite interesting. In a letter from the White House to Brazil, which is part of the series of letters that Donald Trump is currently sending out, notifying all of the countries around the world of what tariff rate they are now going to be hit with, he's addressed this to the president of Brazil. And he said, "Dear Mr. President, I knew and dealt with former President Jair Bolsonaro and respected him greatly, as did most other leaders of countries. The way that Brazil has treated former President Bolsonaro, a highly respected leader throughout the world during his term, including by the United States, is an international disgrace. This trial should not be taking place. It's a witch hunt that should end immediately," in capital letters. And this refers to the fact that Bolsonaro has now been arrested and is on trial for apparently trying to stop the new president from taking over in 2022 when Bolsonaro lost the vote. He's saying that there was some sort of coup attempt here, and that's why he's on trial. Due in part to Brazil's insidious attacks on free elections and fundamental free speech rights of Americans, as illustrated by the Brazilian Supreme Court, which has issued hundreds of secret and unlawful censorship orders to US social media platforms, threatening them with millions of dollars in fines and eviction from the Brazilian social media market. Starting on August the 1st, 2025, we will charge Brazil a tariff of 50% on any and all Brazilian products sent into the United States, separate from all sectoral tariffs. Goods transshipped to evade this 50% tariff will be subject to that higher tariff. So a 50% tariff is absolutely massive. And we'll go on later in the video to have a look at what Brazil is exporting to the USA and how important this is to the Brazilian economy. And I can tell you as a heads up, spoiler alert, it's quite important. This is going to have a really big impact on Brazil. In addition, we have had years to discuss our trading relationship with Brazil and have concluded that we must move away from the long-standing and very unfair trade relationship engendered by Brazil's tariff and non-tariff policies and trade barriers. Our relationship has been, unfortunately, far from reciprocal. We'll have a look at that in a moment. We'll talk about the trade deficit between Brazil and the USA. Please understand that the 50% number is far less than what is needed to have the level playing field we must have with your country. And it is necessary to have this to rectify the grave injustices of the current regime. As you're aware, there will be no tariff if Brazil or companies within your country decide to build or manufacture product within the United States. And in fact, we will do everything possible to get approvals quickly, professionally, and routinely. In other words, in a matter of weeks. So what he's saying there is that basically the tariff won't apply if you move all of your factories to the USA and build things on US soil. But obviously that would then discount the benefits to Brazil, because one of the reasons why Brazil wants to export to the USA is obviously it's good for the Brazilian economy, and also labor is cheaper in Brazil than it is in the USA. So moving the production to the USA would be more expensive. The letter goes on to say, if for any reason you decide to raise your tariffs, then whatever the number you choose to raise them by will be added onto the 50% that we charge. So basically making it very clear that if Brazil wants to retaliate, then there will be a trade war and the number is going to go up in exactly the same way as happened with China right at the beginning of this tariff process. Please understand that these tariffs are necessary to correct the many years of Brazil's tariff and non-tariff policies and trade barriers, causing these unsustainable trade deficits against the United States. This deficit is a major threat to our economy and indeed our national security. Additionally, because of Brazil's continued attacks on the digital trade activities of American companies, as well as other unfair trading practices, I'm directing United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer to immediately initiate a Section 301 investigation of Brazil. I think that relates to the fact that recently there's been some court action saying that Donald Trump hasn't been justified in imposing these tariffs. He said that it's in the interest of national security. And there was a question raised as to whether or not tariffs do actually relate to national security. It's not the same as somebody threatening to invade your country. So I think Donald Trump's making it very clear here that he believes that what's going on is in the interests of national security and therefore is within the laws. If you wish to open your heretofore closed trading markets to the United States and eliminate your tariff and non-tariff policies and trade barriers, we will perhaps consider an adjustment to this letter. These tariffs may be modified upward or downward depending on our relationship with your country. You will never be disappointed with the United States of America. So he's basically saying there, we will reduce the tariffs as long as you change all of your trading practices, which I think is pretty unlikely in the short term. Now, in terms of the immediate impact of this announcement, this chart shows the exchange rate between the Brazilian real and the US dollar. And as you can see, the value of the real has fallen significantly. It's down by almost 2% just on this announcement. And one of the reasons is because the USA is a really important export market for Brazil. If we have a look at this table, it shows the top 10 exports from Brazil to the USA in 2024. So we've got the value in the first column in billions of US dollars, and then the percentage of Brazil's exports in that category. So you can see that the number one exported product was crude petroleum and petroleum products. Brazil has oil, and so the USA does buy some of it, even though the USA produces its own oil and exports some oil. It basically is buying and selling different types of oil across the world. And in 2024, it bought $8.6 billion worth of oil from Brazil. That represented around about 14% of all of Brazil's exports of oil. Second biggest category is semi-finished iron and steel, which was $5.8 billion. And interestingly, that represented 48% of all of Brazil's steel and iron exports. And so the USA is almost half of their market. And that's a problem because, as we just heard in that letter, these tariffs are in addition to any other tariffs. And as was announced at the beginning of June, there is now a 50% tariff on all steel imports into the USA, and this will cover iron and steel. So in theory, compared to where Brazil was just a couple of months ago, we've now got a 50% tariff specifically on those iron and steel products and another 50% tariff on all Brazilian imports. So the price of Brazilian imports of iron and steel is going to double into the USA. And obviously, that's going to be a major problem because from Brazil's point of view, it's half of their export market. It's a really big market. But if the price is doubling in an industry like iron and steel, where everybody is very sensitive to prices, it's likely that the USA is going to look to alternatives. And obviously, one of the things that Donald Trump is trying to promote is US steel. He's trying to make sure, if possible, that people will buy from the US rather than from overseas. So this is going to represent a major threat to those exports, and Brazil may need to find an alternative market for half of its steel. So that's going to be a major issue. Now, if you're in the US and you drink a lot of coffee, I'm sure you've had some Brazilian coffee, whether you know it or not, because Brazil exports almost $2 billion worth of coffee, and that's in all forms. So some of it has been roasted, some of it's in the green form, so it's going and it needs to be processed. And that represents around 30% of all of Brazil's coffee exports. And if you're interested in coffee, I thought it was worth having a quick look at this breakdown, which shows the top 10 countries that the US is importing coffee from. And you can see that Brazil is actually number one on this chart with almost $2 billion worth. And that represents around about 25% of the market. So it's a really big relationship. And obviously, coffee is massive. Everybody loves coffee. And Brazil is where the US is getting the biggest share of it from. If we just canter through the rest of this, you can see Colombia is number 2 on this list. Switzerland, interestingly, number 3. Canada, Guatemala, Honduras, Vietnam, Peru, Mexico, and then we've got everybody else at the bottom. And from Brazil's point of view, as we just discussed, 30% of all of its coffee exports are going to the USA. Now, coffee is a really good example of something where there is elasticity of price. So when we talk about demand, we have inelastic and elastic products. So inelastic demand relates to things where basically you will keep paying for it whatever the price is. So as an example of that, I guess medicines is a good example. That if you need a certain type of medicine, maybe you need it to survive or to make your life comfortable, and the price of that medicine goes up, then you're likely to still want to buy it, despite the fact that it's more expensive. Because if there is no alternative option, then and you want it, then you will pay basically whatever price it goes to. Whereas elastic demand is basically something where it will stretch, that you just think, actually, I don't really care. So Brazilian coffee, I think, is a good example that if you're a coffee lover, now you might love Brazilian coffee, it might be your favorite blend. But if it goes up by 50% in price, then you may think, actually, I don't mind having a bit of Colombian or Ecuadorian or whatever it might be, because it's not really that much different. So the demand for Brazilian coffee, I think, is very elastic, that if the price goes up, it's likely that people will just go to alternative options. So this represents another big threat from Brazil's point of view, that 30% of its market's going to the USA, but if that's now going to cost 50% more, then US consumers and US businesses are likely to look to alternatives that haven't gone up by 50% in price. Aircraft and parts, $2.4 billion of exports in 2024. That represents 30%. Now, I think this is an interesting part, because this is part of the multinational supply chain. So when we're talking about aircraft manufacturers, quite often they will go to various markets where there are subsidies and incentives to set up a factory and build, and where the labor is cheap, and so you can produce something very efficiently. So Boeing, which is based in the USA, which is the big US aircraft manufacturer, has some of its supplies coming from Brazil. Now, interestingly, it's not that easy to switch those out. So in terms of that elastic or inelastic, it's quite inelastic, because it's going to be difficult for a company like Boeing to be able to find an alternative acceptable supply overnight, because you have to go through all of the rigorous testing and approval processes to put a part onto a plane. So if the price of those parts is going up by 50%, then Boeing is likely to just have to pay that. It won't have many other options. So it's likely that those exports will continue in the short term. However, Boeing may well now be looking at replacing those parts with things that are built in the USA or somewhere else where there's a much lower tariff in place. Orange juice, I think, is an interesting one. 1.5 billion of exports in 2024. 65% of the Brazilian exports are going to the USA, so 2/3. Now, orange juice is another good example of elastic demand, that if the price of Brazilian orange juice goes up by 50%, then you can just get orange juice from somewhere else. It pretty much tastes the same wherever it's from. There might be a slight difference if you're an orange juice connoisseur, but I'm not. So I think that represents another big threat to Brazilian exports, because it will be relatively simple for US businesses to buy that orange juice from somewhere else, either in the USA or somewhere overseas. And wood pulp, 1.2 billion, is the last biggest of these categories. That represents 30% of Brazil's exports. And once again, if that's going up by 50% in cost, then it's likely that US businesses and consumers will buy that from somewhere else. So, and that represents 30% of the Brazilian export market. So it's there are some major problems, I think, that are building here from Brazil's point of view. And the reason I wanted to post this video is that I think it raises the question, the fact that Donald Trump in that letter stipulated a lot of things at the beginning of the letter that had nothing to do with what's going on with trade. That was actually talking majority about politics, what's happening with regards to the previous president who's now on trial, and talking about the fact that the USA did not really support the fact that he's on what's called a witch hunt by Donald Trump. So I think that's all really quite interesting. And I wanted to look at this chart, which shows the trade deficit between Brazil and the USA over the past 10 years. Now, if we start off by looking back at 2015, you can see that in that year, the USA imported $21 billion worth of goods from Brazil and exported $21.5 billion. So in 2015, the USA actually had a trade surplus of $500 million. And between 2015 and 2022, there wasn't really a huge deficit that was built. So if you can see that in 2022, the USA imported $31.5 billion worth of goods and exported $30 billion. So there was a trade deficit of $1.5 billion, but not enormous. However, in 2023, the situation started to change. The US imported $38 billion, so a significant increase compared with 2022, but only exported $28 billion. So that represented a fall in the value of goods that Brazil was buying from the US. And so the trade deficit jumped from $1.5 billion to $10 billion. And in 2024, we saw the imports from Brazil increasing further to $40.9 billion, but the exports from the USA to Brazil only increased to $29 billion, which is actually less than it had been in 2022. And that represented a trade deficit of $11.9 billion. And this is what Donald Trump is referring to in terms of the way the relationship is working at the moment. He's saying that Brazil isn't doing its part. It's not buying enough from the USA to eradicate that trade deficit. And in that letter, he said that that was because of restrictive practices and tariffs and things that are being deliberately manipulated by the Brazilian government. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the relationship between the USA and the BRICS countries is really quite fascinating, because BRICS has been around for a long period of time now, more than 10 years it's been in existence, and it hasn't really achieved a great deal. If you watch the recent video that I posted, you'll know that one of the main achievements was setting up the New Development Bank, which was meant to compete with the IMF and the World Bank in terms of helping to fund development projects and infrastructure in all of the partner countries. However, despite the fact that it's had $100 billion of capital to deploy, very little amount of that has actually been invested into projects. There's been one or two or three projects in each of the countries involved, but it's really small beer. It hasn't really achieved its goals so far. And at the recent summit that was held in Brazil, it was announced that it was extending the amount that was going to be available to 200 billion, and that additional 100 billion will be leveraged up to 10 times. So in theory, that could mean that you've got basically $1 trillion worth of investment available. However, when you're talking about only 20 or 30 billion having been drawn down so far, it doesn't look like there's a huge amount of demand. And I think one of the problems that BRICS has is the divisions between all of the different leading countries. So Russia, China, and India will certainly want to be the lead party in all of the negotiations and anything that's agreed. And obviously, that's going to be very difficult to achieve because they've all got big egos and nobody wants to concede to the other parties. And I think that's the problem. It's not operating like a genuine alliance. They're not all pulling together with one common goal. They've all got individual objectives and goals, and it's not really gelling at the moment. And Donald Trump has now targeted BRICS. He wants to break up this alliance. So he recently talked about the fact that they may be hit with a blanket 10% tariff if they're seen to be following anti-American practices. And what we've seen in today's video is that following the release of some of the letters about the tariffs, Brazil has been the first of the BRICS nations that's been targeted, and it's been hit with a whopping 50% tariff on all imports into the USA. And I think it's really interesting that from Brazil's point of view, the USA is a really important trade partner. It represents over $40 billion worth of exports, around about 12 or 13% of all of Brazil's exports go to the USA. However, from the USA's point of view, Brazil's imports only represent around 1% of all of their imports. And when you look at what is being imported from Brazil, all of it is substitutable. So the USA can find those products from somewhere else. It's not like the relationship with China. When the trade war was going on between the USA and China, what China did, I think quite cutely, was really focusing on things that the USA had to buy from China. So the rare earth metals, I think, were the biggest example, where they're used in lots of different applications, particularly in automotive and aerospace, because you can make very, very small magnets using those rare earth minerals. And the problem is, if the USA can't get enough of those rare earth magnets, then that's going to cause major problems in all of those industries. You can't build a car without some of the components, and equally, you can't build an aeroplane if you haven't got everything that you need to put it together. So that quickly led to an agreement being resolved. However, with Brazil, it doesn't really have that leverage. It hasn't got anything unique that the USA needs. It's got things that can be bought from elsewhere. So that's, I think, why Donald Trump has targeted Brazil first. And it will be really interesting to see what happens with the rest of the BRICS countries. And it's not just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America. Sorry, South Africa, not South America. That's a continent. It's not just those five nations. We've also got other nations that have now joined this alliance. And so it will be fascinating to see what happens with all of those different countries and whether or not they are all targeted with much higher tariffs than were being talked about previously. We were previously thinking that maybe Brazil was going to come in at 10 or 15%, but actually this 50% tariff plus the other industry related tariffs such as steel and iron, where it's another 50% on top of that, that is going to decimate the exports from Brazil. And it will be interesting to see whether or not there's any dialogue between Brazil and the USA to try to resolve this matter. Donald Trump has left that open, saying if you change your practices and presumably stop the trial against the previous president, then we may come and have further discussions. But Brazil hasn't come out and said that it's going to do any of those things just yet. But the overall summary of today's video is that what we've seen in the latest round of letters from Donald Trump is that Brazil, which is one of the countries, one of the leading founding countries of BRICS, has been hit with a 50% tariff. And whilst it hasn't been specifically stated that this is because of its membership of BRICS, it was only a few days ago that Donald Trump said that BRICS countries and anybody acting in an anti-American way will be hit with additional tariffs. And I think that is the point of today's video. So hopefully you've found today's video useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member or buy me a coffee member, thank you so much for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated, and here's something to put a smile on your face.